The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Julie Kohler examines the political realignment of white women voters. Erik Loomis walks us through critical moments in our nation's labor history and the strikes that defined them. And Kyle Kondik of Sabato's Crystal Ball gives us his latest political forecast. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Julie Kohler is a writer and social commentator who has been closely following the role of white women in electoral politics. She says that despite the fact that white women voters have leaned Republican for several decades, now is the time that may change. And we say hello to Julie Kohler, Senior Vice President for the Democracy Alliance, a progressive donor network, and she's also a contributing writer to The Nation magazine. Julie Kohler, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You wrote a recent article in The Nation titled, "Can White Women Help Build a Progressive Movement?" It's a provocative question. Why is it one we need to ask?
Yeah, well, there are several reasons, actually, that I kind of went down this path and started to look at white women's role in particular in electoral politics. One is that it's just a numbers question. White women are the largest voting bloc in this country. They represent 69% of the women's vote and 39% of all voters. So a small shift, a relatively small shift in how white women vote can be very determinative for election outcomes. But moreover, I was really interested in the wake of 2016 that there seemed to be a couple of different white women's stories emerging. And one was that, of course, 53% of white women supported Donald Trump in the 2016 election. And that, I think, was a statistic that was surprising to many, but was actually the continuation of a longstanding pattern that majorities of white women in this country vote Republican. And at the same time, we were starting to see this kind of burgeoning, what we call progressive resistance movement, and the emergence of many new organizations that were fueling progressive activism. And what we saw with many of these new groups was that much of the work was really being driven by kind of newly activated, in many cases, kind of suburban white women. And so I was trying to reconcile with what do we make of these two seemingly contradictory trends. And then as time started going on, we had a couple of elections in 2017, the special election in Alabama that resulted in Doug Jones being elected to the U.S. Senate, and the Virginia gubernatorial election, both of which saw a shift and a surge in white women's political participation. What I think is really interesting is we are at this moment. So we will find out this November and then beyond whether this is sort of an aberration, whether kind of there were a few outliers in terms of how white women have voted, or whether we are on the brink of a more permanent political realignment in this country. And I think the latter might be a real possibility.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the article speaks to the political journey of one woman, Lynn Rankinen. Why did you select her, and is she emblematic of many white women today?
Yeah, I think Lynn's story is pretty powerful, both because she's had a, kind of an interesting journey as an individual, but also because she is emblematic, I believe, of many other women. So Lynn was really generous to share her story with me, and I was really taken by a lot of what she talked about, both in terms of kind of her personal political activism that has been really supercharged post 2016 election. It was something that began before the election. She began getting involved with a community organizing group in Minnesota where she lives that was working on a safe and sick time ordinance in St. Paul. And then after the election, she just kind of woke up, like I think many Americans did, and said, what happened? I must kind of get involved at a level that I never had been before. So what Lynn told me is that she had always throughout her life identified as a Democrat. She has been a consistent voter in elections, but she's never viewed herself as being deeply political before. And that has now changed. She is now highly involved in many different kind of progressive kind of political organizations. She's joined her local Indivisible chapter. She's joined the League of Women Voters, kind of a progressive social group. And she's really deepened her involvement with the community organizing group in Minnesota called Isaiah Faith in Minnesota. Recently, just earlier this summer, she attended the Democratic Party convention as a delegate, something that she's never had. So kind of a level of political engagement and activism that was just never part of her life before. And she's really, reported, what she shared with me is that it's been an incredibly empowering journey, that she feels a sense of purpose and a sense of kind of her own and her community's power that she never felt before. And at the same time, what she said is that at home, politics is a source of real isolation and pain. Lynn's husband has always been Republican. They've kind of navigated those differences for many years, but he is also a Donald Trump not only voter, but ongoing supporter. And what she said is that, she used to think they disagreed on policy, and what she questions now is whether or not they share the same values. And I think those dynamics that women have both kind of been, especially many white women, sort of politically energized and awakened post-election, and kind of the calculus has changed for them, I think is something that we're seeing across the country. And also that political awakening has real repercussions and implications for many women's most intimate family and community relationships. And so it's something that we have to think about as we think about supporting white women kind of in their political journeys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you touched on something a few minutes ago, and many of our listeners find it surprising or even perhaps irrational that so many white women support Republican candidates, much less our current president. How do you understand this support?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing to note is that 2016 was not an aberration, but it was the continuation of a long-established pattern. So white women have been voting Republican on average for the better part of many decades. I mean, you can go back to the 1970s, and white women have been Republican majority voters in every presidential election, except for kind of some brief blitz in the 1990s, where in 1992 they were about evenly divided between Republican and Democratic candidates. In 1996, white women supported Bill Clinton by kind of the smallest of margins. But so what we saw was not really something new. The other thing that I think is really important to note is that white women are not a monolithic voting bloc. And so while it's important to note kind of overall how white women vote, I think some of the distinctions among white women are as important as kind of those overall statistics. And specifically what we see is that white women's voting patterns are really highly determined by kind of the interplay of three other, kind of dimensions of identity: levels of education, marital status, and religion. And so what we have to kind of understand is that we have to kind of unpack those dynamics to get a better, I think, and more accurate picture of white women's voting patterns, as well as what's shifting among certain subgroups of white women in the wake of 2016.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Julie Kohler, Senior Vice President for the Democracy Alliance, which is a progressive donor network, and she's also a contributing writer to The Nation magazine. As we know, one of those distinguishing factors of women who supported Trump in 2016 was the lack of a college education. Why is this important?
Yeah, well, I think it really, like I said earlier, it really helps us understand a more complicated and complex story, more nuanced story about white women's voting patterns. So if you look at the 2016 data, we saw about a 20-point difference between non-college educated white women and college educated white women, with about 56% of college educated white women supporting Secretary Clinton and about 36% of non-college educated white women supporting Hillary Clinton. So a pretty noticeable difference. But I think what's equally important to note is that within each of those categories, we saw significant differences, about a 10-point gap based on marital status, with unmarried white women being more likely to vote Democratic than married white women, and on religious background or religious identity, with evangelical Christian white women supporting Donald Trump at rates above 30 points higher than non-evangelicals. So it's really the interplay of kind of all of these dynamics of education, of religious affiliation or identity, and marriage that are highly determinative of how white women vote. And where we've also seen, we talk about college-educated white women as being, where we've seen a great swing. But we have seen in the Virginia and Alabama elections swings in both categories. It's just that we've started at kind of a lower baseline for non-college educated white women than we did for college educated white women.
What are some of the other factors that influence white women's politics?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is indeed like issues like marital status and religious identity. And I think what we have to look at is kind of, they are emblematic of other kind of structural forces. So, people have asked about kind of the marriage gap for a long time. Why is it that we see higher rates of unmarried white women voting Democratic than married white women? And I think there are a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that white men are our most conservative voting bloc in America. And there are white women who experience direct voting pressure from their more conservative husbands. So there's an interpersonal dynamic that's at play for some people. But it's also, I think, more important to look at sort of the way that structural forces kind of affect what is perceived as rational choices. And so, for example, the pay gap, the fact that women earn less than men, that has sort of the practical effect in families of privileging men's careers over women. Family economics are largely associated with, men's economic success. And so it has, I think, the kind of practical effect of yoking perceived economic interests for women, for white women, to their husbands. It's kind of the way that these structural patterns influence the way that we all kind of experience, kind of our lived realities, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. Are a lot of women kind of waking up to this all of a sudden and realizing, hey, wait a minute, it's not about him?
Yeah, well, I think we are beginning to see this swing and this surge. And again, it's not... It might not be the case that overall white women become, vote Democratic at the same rates, certainly of women of color, because women of color really are the base of the Democratic Party. They vote overwhelmingly Democratic, especially Black women. And it's women of color who are really driving progressive social change in this country. So I would not say that we are likely to see kind of rates of Democratic support among white women be equivalent to what we see for women of color, especially with Black women. But I think that we could be seeing in the early stages of this realignment. And I think Donald Trump, and I would actually argue, if Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed to the Supreme Court, they could drive significant numbers of white women out of the Republican Party for a generation to come. I think that it is that the 2016 election and the continuing assaults on women's reproductive rights, kind of women's rights across the board that we're seeing in the Trump administration and now potentially with the Supreme Court, that is indeed a wake-up call for many women and is causing many white women in particular to reassess their political interests.
And now let's talk about the potential cost that some women may pay in terms of their relationships. And you've kind of touched on that a little bit as they switch from Republican to progressive politics. That's part of the issue that I don't think a lot of people, myself included, had ever really thought about. Tell us a bit about that, because you could be a lot of serious wedges in a lot of relationships potentially.
Yeah, it was something that was really interesting, and I interviewed a number of staff members who work at Isaiah, the community organizing group that Lynn was affiliated with in Minnesota, and I also talked to a number of other organizers that are working with different organizations but have a large base that is women, and in particular white women, and they all kind of talked about the fact that many times, as women begin assuming a more public political identity, that can prompt changes in marital and family dynamics, and that sometimes they can be very empowering, and sometimes they can be very painful, and sometimes both simultaneously. You know, Doran Schranz, who's the executive director of Isaiah in Minnesota, said that she's had multiple conversations over the years with women about whether or not they're going to divorce their husbands, kind of as a byproduct of some of this more, this deepening of their own political engagement. And she said sometimes these tensions that appear to be really about sort of time, that many of these women have been primarily focused on their families, and that's where they've really devoted a great deal of their time and energy over the years. And so as that shifts, as they begin to kind of engage in other things, in political causes and political activism, and in something that's also about themselves, that has sometimes repercussions for families. Now, one of the things that Doran said is that it's not always that, you know, by becoming more of an activist, then you're dooming a marriage to divorce. And she said a lot of times that kind of that being part of a community organization like Isaiah, those roles can be renegotiated. And so many people, I don't want to kind of present a falsely bleak picture, but I think it is really important to note that this is a shift that has both interpersonal and kind of societal-wide implications. You know, I think the second wave of the feminist movement in the 1970s had the adage that, the personal is political. And I think what we're seeing right now is that the political is also deeply personal. And so I think it's good for us to be aware of that and to have strategies for helping people negotiate that.
And you mentioned the organization, Isaiah in Minnesota. Do they help counsel women as far as to avoid that huge wedge in the relationship? Is that part of their approach?
Well, I don't know that they would define it as counseling. They're not a mental health organization. They're a community organizing group. But I think that kind of part of what they have gotten, they've seen enough patterns, I guess, over the years where they kind of know some of the dynamics that often kind of accompany this transition, what they call moving people over the bridge, kind of a moving from a feeling of political powerlessness to one of political agency. That's their goal, right? To really help people feel empowered to take action on issues that are affecting their lives and their communities' lives. And they address that from, kind of a progressive faith and moral perspective. So in that process of kind of moving people over the bridge, they, I think, have seen kind of typical patterns play out. And so I think it's not uncommon for them to understand that that's something that, many folks will be dealing with. But it's not the same kind of counseling that you would necessarily think of in a traditional kind of, marriage or family counseling.
Perhaps guidance would have been the better word for me to choose.
Yes. I think they do provide some guidance. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, and experience, right? I mean, they've seen these patterns, and so they can help folks to cross that bridge, as you say. Julie, something else we've started to hear a word more often in political conversation: intersectionality. Why, or what is important about this concept for white women?
Yeah, well, I think this is now where the feminist movement really is and needs to be, is sort of as an intersectional feminist movement, which recognizes the fact that although there is sexism and misogyny in society, there is also racism and, kind of other forms of oppression and privilege. And that people's identities are nested in kind of all these multiple, systems, and that you can't just kind of address one without addressing all of these. And so how that plays out, I think, in white women's political activism is that it requires that white women really reflect on what it means to be a good ally with women of color, something that I think, the history of the feminist movement and the early suffragist movement, didn't always achieve. That often, even within, these movements for gender justice, white women kind of aligned their interests more with white men than they did with women of color. And so I think that's both a reality that white women need to accept, and that there needs to be active work on how to do better going forward. That we really need to be paying attention as white women to following the lead of women of color who, as I said earlier, really comprise the base of not only the Democratic Party, but really who are driving progressive social change in this country. And that white women need to find ways to use privilege in a way that distributes power more equitably. And that white women need to be fighting on issues of racial justice as passionately as we do on issues of gender justice. So this concept, I think, is one that's just really at the center of where feminism is and needs to go going forward, and something that I think all women need to be deeply reflective on, and white women in particular, as they're kind of engaging in their own advocacy.
And it certainly feels like it is moving that way. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens not only in the midterms, but 2020 and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Julie Kohler, Senior Vice President for the Democracy Alliance, a progressive donor network, also contributing writer to The Nation magazine, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Julie, thank you so much for your time with us today. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with you.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the compelling and powerful stories of American workers on strike. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Listen, can you hear it? Listen to the eerie sound of silence from the trumpeteers and congressional Republicans who so loudly cheered themselves just a year ago for bestowing a $1 trillion tax giveaway on corporate elites. They told us they did it not for the rich, but to help the middle class and poor families. How would enriching the already rich benefit the rest of us? Trickle-down economics 101, said Trump and company, explaining that giving more money to elites would spark, quote, an immediate jump in wage growth, because CEOs would use their bonanza to reward workers for their productivity. The White House even got specific, declaring that average pay would jump as much as $9,000 per person. But here we are in the thick of the 2018 congressional elections, and silence. Not a single lawmaker who voted for this grand ideological promise is mentioning it, much less running ads touting their role and hammering the plan into law. Why so shy? Because their trickle-down giveaway was a crude hoax from the start. CEOs spent the GOP's trillion-dollar boondoggle on lifting their own exorbitant pay. Moneyed elites got the gold mine, working families got the shaft. Far from a $9,000 income boost, the workaday majority of Americans now find that their hourly earnings are lower than a year ago. But who cares? Being a trumpeter Republican means never admitting your lies and never apologizing. Steve Mnuchin, a former Wall Street banker who's now the Treasury Secretary, is a perfect example of a blasé, ethically challenged Trump huckster. He recently shrugged off the failure of the bloated tax cut to raise working people's income. Wages are going up on some people, he declared disingenuously. This is Jim Hightower saying, yeah, for multimillionaires like him. Yet he wonders why most Americans despise him and his ilk.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Historian Eric Loomis has an assignment for us. If we truly want to understand the history of labor movements in the United States, look to the moments when workers went on strike. It's a reminder, he says, that small groups of people can create radical change. And we say hello to Erik Loomis, an environmental and labor historian at the University of Rhode Island. His newest book from New Press is A History of America in 10 Strikes, described as a thrilling account of 10 moments in history when labor challenged the very nature of power in America. Erik Loomis, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. You know, we hardly have time to go over all 10 moments, but we will start where you start, which is the Lowell Mill girls' strike in the 1830s. Tell us why you began with this story and what you want us to remember about this moment.
Sure. A few things. You know, if we think about the history of American labor, there's many different places we can start that, right? But if we're thinking about telling the whole history of America through the mirror, the window of strikes, this is a pretty sensible place to start. Or there's two sort of sensible places to start, actually. One is slavery, which is the centerpiece of sort of early labor in America, and then also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And that's what the Lowell Mill Girls Strike is intended to do. So, you know, around 1794, you begin to see the first factories in the United States. And the labor conditions are really, really bad from the beginning. They use a lot of child labor, very long hours. But this is actually considered kind of normal in some ways because most of these young people came off of farms, and farm kids were used to working long hours. Over time, the factories get bigger, they get louder, and Americans are very worried. And by this, I mean people like Thomas Jefferson, for instance. He's very worried. What will factories do to America? Because he had a vision of America as an agrarian paradise of independent landowners, farmers. And they looked at what was happening in Britain and other parts of Northern Europe where the Industrial Revolution had broken in, and the conditions were very, very bad. And so in Lowell, Massachusetts in the 1820s, there is an attempt to create a model town where you would bring in respectable workers, in this case, the young daughters of farmers, mostly, coming out of the farms of New England. They come there, they're going to work for a few years, and then they're going to get educated, there's going to be culture, and then they're going to go back home and get married. This is the kind of the ideal. And to some extent, they try to do this, right? So, you know, these young women might come from New Hampshire or Maine, and they come to Lowell, Mass., and they work for a few years, and Ralph Waldo Emerson comes and gives a lecture, and they have their newspapers, and they write poetry. And that all sounds great. here's the problem. It was loud. It was hot. The days were very long. People got hurt on the job. And over time, these young women say, this work is really awful. And so they begin to form some of America's first labor unions. Not the very first, but some of the very first. And they use their power as, not just the poorest of the poor, but as so-called respectable young women to protest against these terrible labor conditions, one of the first major strikes in American history. And so starting with that story does a couple of things. It shows how from the very beginnings of industrialization, workers have resisted the unpleasant and dangerous parts of their work. And the other thing it does is it shows how women have always been central to the labor movement. Too often when we think about labor and we think about strikes, or even when we think about work, we think about men. And we think about men getting paid, men going on strike. But women have always worked. Much of that is unpaid labor in the home. But it's very important to center the experience of women, not only in our labor history and our history of work, but also in American history. And too often that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting thing, you also include slaves during the Civil War. Does it surprise people some to hear about slaves striking?
Yeah, often it does. So the way I tell this story, it comes from, the great African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, and he did many wonderful things through his life. In 1935, publishes a book called Black Reconstruction. And in there, he talks about how slaves walked off the job during the Civil War in what he calls a general strike, which is a strike where everybody sort of stops working at the same time. This was totally unplanned. But what was really happening is that slaves were resisting their masters, and slaves had always resisted their masters. And so what happens is that when Union troops go into the South to fight the Civil War, slaves begin pouring toward Union lines. And this actually does very much to win the war for the North. Because as we know, Abraham Lincoln wasn't really sure what to do about slavery when the war starts. In the North, the war isn't necessarily about slavery for a lot of people, but the slaves make it about slavery by forcing the Union's hand, because then they go to the Union Army, and the Union Army has to say, well, what are we going to do with these people? And pretty quickly, what happens is they begin to say, okay, we will bring these people in and have them work for us. If they're enemy property, so we will have them, we are confiscating their property. And this convinces slaves everywhere, as soon as they can, to start fleeing toward Union lines. Okay, so part of the problem, though, here is that we don't often think about slaves as regular workers, right? But the point of slavery is not racism. Racism undergirds slavery. The point of slavery is a labor system. The point of slavery is to provide the cheapest labor possible. And that's what slavery ultimately did. Total employer control over these unpaid workers, right? And so we have to see slaves as workers. And we have to see the history of slavery as a history of work. And what we have to see is the slaves walking off their job is not only resistance, but the most important labor action in American history, as it ends the most unjust moment, or the most unjust practice in all of American history.
Fascinating. We're speaking with Erik Loomis. He's an environmental and labor historian at the University of Rhode Island, and his new book is A History of America in 10 Strikes. Moving ahead a bit in history, Eric, let's talk about the Flint sit-down strike against General Motors in the 1930s. Some describe it as one of the most important strikes in American history. What was significant about this strike?
Sure. So the Flint strike is a strike of auto workers working for General Motors, and they use a innovative tactic that was becoming kind of common in the 1930s and a little bit before that too in some areas, of just sitting down on the job instead of leaving. And the reason they would do that, the number one reason, is that if they knew if they walked off the job, that what would happen is that the employer, General Motors, would bring in strike breakers. And so what they decide to do is sit down on the job with the pretty smart, rational decision that General Motors is going to be far less likely to violently retake the plant because they could destroy the plant to do so. Okay? And so this works over time, and what it does is not only does it establish the United Auto Workers as a major part of the American labor movement, but the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the mass industrial organizing that brings millions of workers into the American labor movement and really helps create the middle class in America over the next 20 to 30 years. But there's one thing that is often not talked about here that I think is really, really important about this strike. The ways that American workers are able to win strikes is really only if they elect politicians who will use the government as a fair arbitrator between workers and employers. And in most of American history, that has not happened. Employers and the government have worked together to crush labor movements. That's what's going on today, right? And so what happens is that if American workers, angry at the Republican Party's response to the Great Depression and wanting a pretty radical change, had not elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 over the Republican Herbert Hoover, this strike would not have succeeded. Moreover, if these very workers had not elected a really liberal governor by the name of Frank Murphy to be governor of Michigan, what almost certainly would have happened is what General Motors wanted, which was the governor of Michigan to call in the National Guard and retake the plant by force. And so part of the story here is that if workers are going to succeed in the past or in the present, what they have to do is not only organize, but they also have to elect the politicians that are going to use the government fairly in labor disputes and not be basically the private army of employers.
The Lordstown strike in 1972, again against General Motors, has somewhat a notorious history for how the union collaborated with management. What happened?
Sure. So by the 1960s, let me go back a little bit. So 1940s, 1950s, you have the very people who won that Flint strike and other General Motors and auto workers, and they are, they're moving in the middle class, right? They're getting more money, they have good wages, they have good benefits, they're taking vacations, they get retirement pay, etc. But I got to be honest, the job's not very much fun. Working in an auto factory was basically being a machine. And what had happened by the early 1970s, right? You have the 60s, the Vietnam generation, a lot of youthful discontent, and a lot of those, factory workers from the 1930s and 40s were retiring. And so GM was hiring a whole bunch of new people in this plant in Lordstown, Ohio, which is near Youngstown. And at the same time, GM was working to try to compete in the small car market with these Japanese cars that were starting to enter the market, right? And so they're creating this car called the Chevy Vega. They didn't really believe in it, and so they create this plant in Lordstown. They have this very young workforce, and they try to make money off of this pretty cheap car by driving the workforce as hard as they can. They speed up the work, they mechanize the work. And it's really very unpleasant work. And you have a 60s generation saying, we don't want to be our fathers and live for 30 to 35 years doing the same thing. The problem was here is that the United Auto Workers was still really controlled by the same generation who had organized it 35 years earlier. And so you have a bunch of old guys in Detroit and a bunch of young workers in Ohio, and they're clashing too. And so what happens when they go on strike is that the auto workers and GM both try to manage this strike to get the workers back on the job and not really solve any of these problems. But, at the same time, the problems that the Lordstown workers faced in part was that they just hated the job. How do you negotiate that into a union contract? And so a lot of that strike at Lordstown was just being angry. And that put the UAW in a tough position. But they didn't really respond very well either. So, the union movement by the 70s was not as robust as it could have been.
Mm-hmm. You also included air traffic controllers in the book, a moment we will remember, most of us anyway, because of the role of Ronald Reagan, and perhaps may have been a turning point for unions. Would you agree?
Well, yes. It's not the only turning point, but it's the most prominent. By the 70s, what you see is corporations really seeking to retake control of the government from the liberals, who had more or less kind of controlled it for those past few decades, right? By the 60s and 70s, you see, labor unions doing well, environmental regulations getting passed, consumer regulations getting passed, and conservative business people began to organize in the 70s to resist this. And Ronald Reagan became a front person for them. And then when he gets elected to the presidency in 1981, he's not, Reagan himself had not had a particularly anti-union past, but the air traffic controllers were, honestly, they were kind of jerks. They would shut down the airlines at any given time, like Thanksgiving or Christmas, throwing the plans of millions of people up in the air. And they didn't consult with other unions either. And in fact, they endorsed Ronald Reagan for the presidency because most of the men in that union, it was a white male union, and they were pretty politically conservative. But they went on strike in 1981 thinking that because they controlled the air, that there was nothing the government could do. And Reagan goes in and he fires them all, even though they had supported him. And what that does is it tells private industry that they can start busting unions too. And so through the 80s, building on what happened in 1981, you have corporations going and just destroying unions they had had for 40 years, really decimating private sector unionism, and it has not recovered to the present. So yes, absolutely a huge turning point in our history.
Yeah. We're speaking with Erik Loomis, environmental and labor historian at the University of Rhode Island. His newest book from New Press is A History of America in 10 Strikes. Another strike, this one not in the book, but which you have written about, is the prison workers' strike, which recently ended. In an op-ed in the New York Times, these are hard workers represented by a union. What do you hope these workers can achieve?
Well, the reality is that prison labor is a huge part of our economy, and we don't even recognize it. There are hundreds of thousands of workers every day who are laboring for almost nothing. And every one of those workers who is laboring for almost nothing is not only being exploited, but it also undermines the labor sector for the rest of us. If you're an employer, why would you hire non-prison workers and pay them even the minimum wage when you could pay them $3 a day? Right? And so this is a huge part of our economy, and these workers don't really have much of a choice. And of course, part of it is the prison system is tremendously too big anyway. It exploits especially people of color. In fact, really in this op-ed I wrote for the New York Times, I connect it back to slavery, because through all of American history, white people have demanded free labor from people of color. This is central to our history, not only African Americans, but also Native Americans, Latinos. And this is a reality of our history. And so these strikers, these people, it's very hard to organize in the prisons because they don't have access to the basic tools of freedom that the rest of us do. But what they have done is brought the first real major attention to prison labor in a long time. And I think that is very important. In the 70s, there was a similar kind of strike. And what that eventually helped lead to was the attention necessary to throw out as unconstitutional a labor system in Texas prisons that forced prisoners to work in segregated work gangs in cotton fields for no money at all, right? Which is effectively slavery. And so hopefully what this prison strike does is gather the attention necessary to reform this prison labor system and treat people like humans, not like slaves.
Mm-hmm. As you look at all these stories, what are the common themes and lessons that emerge?
Yeah. There are three major themes. Okay. One is that whether there's a labor movement in terms of unions or not, whether the government is going to allow unions to be successful or not, workers will always fight back for what they think is right. Okay? So Republicans could destroy the American labor movement. That's their goal. They may well do so, but workers will continue to struggle, just like we've seen in these teachers in West Virginia and Oklahoma and other states this past spring, and probably starting again here in the fall of 2018. The second lesson is that, to go back to what I said about Flint, is that workers to succeed have to elect the politicians that will use the government in at least a neutral manner. There's almost no examples of American workers successfully organizing for a union if the government is on the side of the employer. So the political game is something that workers have to play. And third, and this is a little more depressing, is that the biggest thing getting in the way of worker solidarity throughout American history is racism. Too often in American history, the white working class chooses its white interests over its class interests. People often say, well, why do these workers vote against their interests? For instance, white workers voting for Donald Trump. They're not voting against their interests. They're voting for their white interests. And until the white working class understands that they are destroying their ability to succeed if they vote based on their racial prejudice instead of their class interest, it's very hard for American labor to succeed. And so part of what we have to do is have a very strongly anti-racist labor movement if we're to overcome this.
Mm-hmm. The history of the labor movement is certainly a contested space, often influenced by the subjectivity of prevailing powers. What are some of the common myths about these labor struggles, and why is it so important to get the history right?
Sure. I mean, a lot of these myths about the labor struggles, actually, oftentimes they're on the left. It's that workers came together and they showed solidarity and they won. And if only union leaders were more radical, they would win too. These labor union leaders today are sellouts, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's actually a very pervasive myth, particularly on the left. And I think it's very important to get the real history. And to some extent, this book is written for people who are already kind of liberal or activists, to make them smarter, basically, to get them the real history of how workers have organized or not organized in order to use these tools of organizing effectively, right? And so if we come into organizing or democratic politics with myths about how things have happened, then we're going to look back and we're going to say, why aren't these labor union leaders like those great labor union leaders of the 1930s, right? That we fail because we don't have these great labor leaders of the past. But the reality is that most of those labor leaders of the past weren't that great either. And that if we can understand the real reasons why unions succeed or fail, then we can have a smarter progressive movement that organizes more effectively, stops with mythology that is self-destructive, and moves ahead in an effective, strong, and smart manner to help fix all the many problems in this country.
The name of the book, A History of America in 10 Strikes, 10 Moments in History When Labor Challenged the Very Nature of Power in America. And the author, Erik Loomis, environmental and labor historian at the University of Rhode Island, who's joined us today on America's Democrats podcast. Eric, thank you very much. Really enjoyed talking with you about it today, and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, as we move into the final 4 weeks before the midterm elections, Kyle Kondik of Sabato's Crystal Ball tells Bill Press why he thinks Democrats still have a chance to turn the House, but don't count on the Senate.
Look who's in studio with us, Kyle Kondik from the Center for Politics down at the University of Virginia. Hello, Kyle. Good to see
Bill,
you.
How many did you add from that New York Times story the other day?
Right. No. with all the tax scams.
Yeah, right. I heard you talking about it before I came on.
Plus his mocking of Christine Blasey Ford. They were big, too, yesterday. I saw again, I looked yesterday that the Washington Post in its latest, they track all the misstatements or lies.
It's like 4,000, isn't it, or something?
It's
like
over 4,000.
Yeah.
7.6 a day is what they. average.
And it is interesting, too, that the president's approval was down in September, and then it's back up. I mean, up being a relative term, it's like 42, 44 points or something. But he does do better when he's not in the news. I'm convinced of it.
Really?
Yeah, because the Kavanaugh story sort of being the dominant political story, the president's approval just tends to go up. And we saw it during the campaign, too. And that's part of the reason why Clinton lost, is because she was the focus of the campaign at the end, not Trump.
Right. How about that? Kyle, we've been trucking here for the last 40 minutes or so, Peter.
Yes,
and,
indeed.
Stirring up a little dust, as we love to do.
Plenty of comments on Twitter, where we are tweeting at BP Show, at BP Show. First of all, I want to mention we have a poll up right now that you can go vote on. The poll question is, will Democrats vote no to oppose Brett Kavanaugh? Go and let us know.
Democratic senators. Right?
Yes.
Right.
Will they vote no to oppose Kavanaugh? You can choose yes, no, or depends on the FBI report. Right now, 51% of you think that the Democrats will, in fact, vote no.
That means all of them will.
All of them.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I'd vote no on that one.
Okay. We also got a couple of comments, a little bit of pushback on our praise for Jeff Bezos. One stipulation here on the $15 minimum wage situation is that Amazon warehouse workers are no longer eligible to receive monthly bonuses or stock awards. So, in fact, some workers will make less money, which makes sense. That's exactly what big corporations will do. They'll find a way to save money while trying to give money. It doesn't shock me at all.
Give with one hand and take away on the other.
It doesn't shock me.
I'm going to double check that. I didn't know that.
We had a bunch of people comment about it, so
okay.
We should double check that.
I'm not saying they're not telling the truth.
No.
I'm just saying I did not know that.
Yeah. Also on Kavanaugh, KG says this was a test for the FBI, and they have failed so far.
Total.
Time to start watching out for leaks. We'll see if the FBI report gets leaked out. Yeah, exactly. Remember, if you have a comment on any topic at any time, just find us on Twitter at BP Show.
We know if that report were at the White House, it would leak. No, now that's in the Senate. Maybe not. I don't know. So, Kyle, we are, what are we?
About a month from the election,
from the midterm. Overall, right, midterms don't generate that much excitement. Overall, this year, what do you see?
I think turnout's going to be high. If you look at the polls sort of asking people, how enthusiastic are you to vote? How certain are you to vote? Although in some of these polls, people, 65, 70% of people say that they're certain to vote. And we know we know many of them are lying. People know that it's socially acceptable or socially desirable to say you're going to vote. And of course you don't.
Yeah.
However, turnout in 2014 was just awful. It was like 36%. And you had states like Ohio, I think California was awful that year, Nevada, where there wasn't much competition, there wasn't much excitement. I think turnout's going to be much higher. I think it's going to be, I actually think it might be higher than 06 and 10, not in terms of the numbers. Of course, the numbers of votes are growing because the population grows, but I think you could see turnout, go over 40%. It sort of makes sense. I mean, Americans hate politics, but they're inundated with them, and they can't take their eyes off.
I saw a figure the other day. I was getting ready for a speech out in San Antonio last week, where in the Democratic primaries so far in this year, like those primaries, right? Turnout was up 84% over 4 years ago, and in the Republican primary, it was up 24%.
That's right. Yeah. So
there is more enthusiasm overall, but particularly on the left. Right?
And I think, part of the thing with these midterms is that, the Republican leaning demographics are the more predictable voters. And so basically the Republican Party is older and whiter. You could also say historically that the Republican Party was older, whiter, and more educated. However, that more educated bloc is sort of moving toward the Democrats, particularly in this election. So that's probably going to help Democrats with turnout.
What's driving it?
Trump's driving it. I mean, people are reacting to Trump both positively, but sort of more negatively. So again, I think we're gonna have a big turnout this year, and I think that's generally benefits the Democrats a little bit more, because if the turnout's bigger, that means that less regular midterm voters are turning out, and those voters are probably more likely to be Democratic.
And women?
Through the roof for Democrats, and I think that if the Democrats do in fact win the House, I think it's going to be driven by a lot of these affluent, highly educated suburban districts, and I think that college-educated women in those districts are going to be voting overwhelmingly Democratic in many places. And that does seem to be where the Democratic House gains are likeliest to be concentrated, is in those sort of high-end suburban districts. Now, there are all sorts of different kinds of districts across the country. But if you look at the places where maybe Clinton ran better than Obama did, and there are districts like that across the Sun Belt, there are a lot of them in the Midwest, actually, even though there are many more where Trump did better than Romney. Those are the places where I think you're really seeing the movement in the House right now.
All right, so let's talk House. And, of course, the big question is House or Senate, but particularly focusing on the House, do you see a strong likelihood that Democrats, or what is the likelihood Democrats will take back control of the House?
I definitely think they're favored. I don't know what percentage I would put on it, and I urge a little bit of caution here, just because there are enough competitive seats right now, enough ones that look close, that, Democrats need 23. Like right now, I'd probably say, they should probably get somewhere in the low 30s. But if some of those 50-50 races break the other way, you could end up at D plus 21 or something, and, a little bit short. So I just urge a little caution on that. But the broad trends, I think, are generally positive for Democrats. It feels like it's sort of been building in the House. It's not like things have changed really all that much. I mean, that's part of the problem for the Republicans, is that throughout the cycle, we've always had the caveat, there's time for things to change. And we're sort of running out of time for that to happen. And the general trend has been toward Democrats favored in the House, and that's where we remain.
Well, when I look at your site, or look at the Cook report, and look at some of the others, I mean, we're talking, yes, you mentioned 23, but there are 80 to 100 seats in play?
That might be a little high, but yeah, I mean, that's basically it. I mean, 70, 80 seats. And there are a bunch of Republican House incumbents who are used to having very easy elections, who instead of getting 65% are going to get more like 55%. And the ones who used to get 55%, a lot of them are going to lose. I mean, and one thing that's been incredible this week is Democratic fundraising. I mean, you have Democrats in seats that I rate as safe, and maybe I'm wrong to do so, raising, $750,000. Like, let me give you an example. There's a longtime Republican in New Jersey, Chris Smith, who got elected in 1980. He represents Trenton and other parts of that state. Smith has really had easy elections for much of his career. The guy running against him, a Democrat named Josh Well, raised almost $750,000. And again, this is for a seat that is not really on anybody's radar, or most people's radar anyway. So it's going to be a big there's going to be a lot of competition on the map. And again, members who may even been used to winning by 10, 15 points, some of them are going to lose too.
Right. Some of the big, there's so many House seats, unlike the Senate races,
right.
It's harder to put a name on them and remember, the focus on them, because, again, out of, 435, right?
Right.
But in California, there are several high-profile, like Darrell Iss's old seat,
right.
Dana Rohrabacher's seat. And I have a particular interest in California. Obviously, these are all
Bill,
races in which I was involved at one time.
Well, as someone who I know has been involved in California politics for a long time, it must seem crazy to you that Democrats have a good shot to win these districts in, say, Orange County.
We're talking about the possibility of 3, 4, 5 seats in Orange County.
Well, and the Democrats already hold 39 of the 53 House seats in California, and it's not inconceivable that they could get to, 44, 45. I mean, we were talking before we started that Mimi Walters, a conservative Republican in Orange County, who when I moved that race from Lean's Republican to toss-up, I had Republicans telling me that I was nuts to do so. She's losing. I mean, she's behind right now. Doesn't mean she's going to lose, but she's down. I mean, the LA Times came out with some polls this morning. Mm-hmm. She was down 7 points to her Democratic opponent. The New York Times also found her down, I think, 6 points in their own polling. Rohrabacher's in a toss toss-up race. The Darrell Issa seat that's now open, he's retiring. That seat's gone for the Republicans. So lots of opportunities in California for Democrats. And again, you think, boy, they've already got 39 of 53 seats, and yet there is the capacity for them to grow, and that's because of Trump.
Right. And so it looks like that it's the Central Valley is where the Republicans are holding on to their seats, like, sadly to me, Devin Nunes.
Yeah, although, Nunes should be fine, but the LA Times poll only found him up 8, and his opponent, a guy named Andrew Jans, has also raised just an outrageous amount of money. So Nunes is another one who's gonna not do as well as he usually does, but should still be fine. And then the other one that stands out in the Central Valley is David Valadao. He represents a district that Clinton won by, I think, 15 or 16 points, and yet he remains a very strong a strong incumbent and seems to be leading. One place where Democrats are lagging are in a few districts where there's a kind of a heavy Hispanic population, sort of a lower turnout districts. Those places don't seem to be swinging the way that the kind of higher end, wealthy suburban districts are.
Northern Virginia has 2 or 3 very interesting races. Barbara Comstock, of course. Those of us who live in the district see a lot of TV,
right?
Because that's the only way to get TV in that district. But then Leslie Coburn,
she's running in the district that covers University of Virginia in Virginia 5. There's Dave Bratt, who of course famously beat Eric Cantor in 2014. He's running in a suburban Richmond seat
with a strong challenger.
Very strong challenger, Abigail Spanberger. So Barbara Comstock, it's been this interesting dispute amongst Republicans as to whether she is toast or not, basically. And you have these 2 big outside groups on the Republican side: National Republican Congressional Committee, which is sort of the standard old traditional committee, and then Congressional Leadership Fund, which is a super PAC that has essentially supplanted NRCC as the big force on that side. CLF has never thought Comstock had a good chance to win. NRCC has a giant ad reservation there. Polling suggests that Comstock is losing, but so there's this dispute on the Republican side as to how vulnerable she truly is. I think she's an underdog at this point, Comstock.
Meaning
that I think Jennifer Wexton, the Democrat, is favored in that seat now. Right. There was a new poll from Christopher Newport University. They had Wexton up 7, the Democrat. Monmouth had another poll this week. The Democrat was up 6 points. So that's a good place to be in. I mean, if you're an incumbent in the low 40s in a district that probably isn't favorable to your party, that's a bad place to be. I mean, that's a position where like Mimi Walters is in too.
Right. So if we're looking at the House with a reasonably good chance for Democrats to take it back, is there any chance Democrats could take back the Senate as well?
There is, although I struggle with it because I just let me really oversimplify things here. Okay, so obviously there are a bunch of competitive Senate races, a lot of them taking place in dark red states.
Yeah.
The Democrats need to win 28 of the 35 Senate seats being contested this year. They already hold 26 of the 35, which is a lot to hold on a single map.
Yeah, they have to hold those and
get 2 more. So 28 of 35. That means they'd have to win 80% of all the Senate seats being contested this year. In the history of Senate popular elections, which goes back about 100 years to the progressive era, one party has won 80% or more of the Senate seats on a single map only twice. 1932 and 1964, and we know those were huge Democratic years. FDR's first election and LBJ's first election, total wave years. So it's not impossible, but historically it's very difficult. And another way to look at it is that there are 3 seats in particular that the Democrats need to win at least one. Okay. North Dakota, which is where Heidi Heitkamp is running, she's clearly the most endangered Democratic incumbent. There was a Fox News had a poll out last night that's showing her down a dozen points. Whoa. I don't believe that, although I've seen other polls with her down that much. So she's behind for sure. Tennessee, Democrats would need to win, again, one of these 3. North Dakota, Tennessee, open seat. Phil Bredesen, Democratic candidate, is strong, but Tennessee is a blood red state these days. And then the third one would be Texas, where, of course, that's probably the most covered Senate race in the whole country. But I think Ted Cruz is still leading. So the point is that
they need one of those.
They need one of those 3, and if they don't, they really can't do it unless they win like Mississippi or something, which is going to go to a runoff. And that even assumes that Claire McCaskill wins in Missouri, which is far from a slam dunk, or Joe Donnelly wins in Indiana, and also the Democrats were to pick up Nevada and Arizona. And so again, the Democrats essentially have to sweep all but one or two of the most competitive races, which I just think is hard.
Arizona and Nevada, however, do look,
I think,
potentially good.
They're both very close.
Yeah.
I think they're certainly both winnable for the Democrats, but I do think that I guess Nevada probably would come home in the end for the Democrats by a few points. I kind of feel the same way about Florida, by the way, which is another marquee race.
I want to get to Florida,
but then Arizona Sinema has like a very small lead.
Yeah, I mean, it's to me. The idea that there'd be a chance in Arizona is almost unthinkable because Arizona's so red. But Nevada's getting more and more purple, if not purple-blue, right?
Yeah, I mean, Nevada seems to me, again, very similar to Florida in that their states with sort of conflicting political demographic patterns to the point where they seem like basically kind of 50-50 states, and Arizona's kind of trending that way too.
Right. Now, I mentioned just before you came in, you probably heard New Jersey.
Yeah.
There was some thought that Menendez, with his legal problems, might be in trouble. The latest Quinnipiac poll shows him up 11 points.
Yeah, and other polls have been less bullish on him. I still think he should be okay, but he's a weak incumbent. I do think that New Jersey is one of the few kind of machine political states that we have left in the country.
Right.
There's just lots of ways in which sort of the old guard is favored in terms of the electoral rules. Like, for instance, in primaries in New Jersey, the county parties determine which name goes first. Most states, they alternate the names on the ballot. But it's just one little way that the preferred, machine candidates get favored. I think Democrats should have just cut Menendez loose and ran somebody else, and they would be totally fine. As it stands, Menendez is probably still going to win, I think.
Right. New Jersey politics is unique.
Yeah.
I ran a Jerry Brown presidential primary in New Jersey, which Jerry won, and I was told that by the party boss in southern New Jersey, don't even bother to come down here because we're going to deliver that for you and you don't have to do anything.
Right.
And then I was told by the party boss in Hudson County, keep your people out of Hudson County. I said, we can't do that. It's the most populous county in the state.
Right.
And he says, I'm telling you, stay the hell out of Hudson County. It's yours. You're going to get Hudson County. So,
right.
And by the way, they both delivered.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of politics, man, I love. That machine,
people make the promises and then they deliver.
The machine politics, right?
Right.
Florida, you mentioned Florida. Let's just be honest. Bill Nelson, great guy, but not the greatest candidate.
I think
is Andrew Gillum going to save his?
I think that's fair to say. What's interesting is that there was a while after the primary where Andrew Gillum, the Democratic gubernatorial candidate, was running like clearly better than Nelson. Now it seems like they've kind of come into alignment, and that both Gillum and Nelson have kind of very small leads, and that makes sense to me. I mean, I don't know how you could vote for Andrew Gillum and Rick Scott or Bill Nelson and Ron DeSantis.
Yeah,
I mean, there will be a handful of people who do that, but generally speaking, I think that both races are toss-ups. Gillum and Nelson probably have tiny leads in both right now.
And it's going to be interesting because this really does define kind of where Florida's heading, right?
Right. Yeah, and certainly.
So you have Ron DeSantis, the total Trumper.
Mm-hmm.
And Rick Scott, the billionaire, and can spend as much anything that he wants to win that Senate seat. But to me, it's a question of where Florida's going.
Well, and Gillum, like Nelson, is very much in the tradition of the kinds of statewide Democrats that win there, and of course Nelson himself has had a very successful career. Nelson isn't necessarily he's certainly not like an old line Southern conservative, but he's also not like a total far left person. Gillum kind of is. I mean, Gillum is a very left wing candidate, and an African American, very left wing potential governor of Florida. That would be something a lot different than what we're used to.
Right. Have you? I'm sure you have. Other don't you think? I think we've touched on the biggest Senate races.
We didn't mention like West Virginia and Montana. I think that I think the Tester race.
Manchin, come on, Joe Manchin's solid.
Manchin should be okay. Tester, I think he's leading, but only by a little bit. So that's one to watch.
Joe Donnelly in Indiana.
I think he's doing okay. I mean, it's his lead is very marginal, but I think he's doing okay.
Okay, so then you mentioned Andrew Gillum. That's one of the most exciting stuff. Oh, Texas,
right?
Texas.
I think Cruz is leading, probably not by. Let's put it this way: Clinton lost Texas by 9 points. It's actually a pretty good showing for a Democrat. I'd be surprised if O'Rourke lost by that amount. I think O'Rourke is going to keep it closer than that. Now, I know the Republicans are very worried about the immense resources that O'Rourke has to bring to bear here.
Could O'Rourke win?
Yes.
Yes.
I would rather be Cruz though in that state. Okay. I think it's probably like a 4 or 5 point race at this point.
Other governors' races that are interesting. You mentioned we talked about Florida. It's just about a minute left, but. Georgia, Stacey Abrams, and Maryland Vangelis.
We just, I think Larry Hogan, the Republican in Maryland, should be okay. We just moved Georgia to a toss-up with the expectation that it'll go to runoff. So that would be in December. The most important place in the governor's race
been safe Republican.
It leans Republican, so we thought it was competitive, but we see it as a true toss-up now. And there are a lot of contradictory numbers in that race. Key place to watch in the governor's race is the Midwest. There are 6 big races there. The Democrats currently control only 1 in Minnesota. The Democrats could potentially sweep all the Midwest governorships.
There are 6 up?
There's 6 up. Michigan and Illinois, they look good to pick up. Ohio's a total toss-up. Iowa's a total toss-up. Scott Walker is probably behind in Wisconsin, but that's still a toss-up too.
Yeah, that would be huge.
Well, and it's very important for redistricting because the governors and Republicans had great maps in all those states.
Where can people follow you?
Centerforpolitics.org/crystal ball.
Okay, and Centerforpolitics.org/crystal ball. Kyle Kondik, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Bill.
All right.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Julie Kohler, Eric Loomis, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.